Djibouti has joined the long list of African countries who have declared war on presidential term limits. This tiny African nation, we are talking barely the size of New Jersey with only about 1.2 million people, and it's sitting right at one of the most strategic waterways on the entire planet. So last Sunday, that's October 26th, 2025, all 65 lawmakers in Djibouti's National Assembly, they all showed up, they all voted, and it was unanimous. They voted to scrap the constitutional age limit, the one that would have stopped their 77-year-old president from running again. There was no debate, no opposition, just a clean sweep. It basically just says Guelleh can stay in power as long as he is breathing. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. We have seen this movie before because Uganda, they did it in 2017, so Museveni could keep going past age 75. Cameroon did it back in 2008. Rwanda did it in 2015 for Paul Kagame. And Chad, you got to get this. Chad did the exact same thing just 3 weeks before Djibouti. We are just watching these constitutional guardrails, the ones that we are supposed to protect democracy, get torn down one by one right across the African continent. But here's why Djibouti, it just hits different. This isn't just about some aging president who won't leave office. No, we are talking about a country that hosts more foreign military bases than almost anywhere else on earth. We have American troops there, French forces, the Chinese military, Japanese, Italian, all of them fully represented. They are all operating within miles of each other. And this is in a country of just 1 million people. This country, it controls the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. That's where a massive chunk of global trade flows through every single day. Now, these foreign powers, they are paying hundreds of millions in rent and partnerships every year. And yet, they are all staying pretty quiet right now as the democratic space just disappears. So, when Djibouti's parliament votes to get Guelleh run forever, we have to ask the hard question. Is this really about regional stability like the government is claiming? Or is this about something else, about foreign powers who would rather deal with one predictable strongman than risk democratic change messing with their strategic interest? And what does this pattern, because we are seeing it from East Africa to Central Africa to West Africa, what does it tell us about who is really benefiting when these constitutional rules just vanish, whenever it is convenient for people in power? That's what we are diving into today. What actually went down in that parliament, how this small nation became this critical piece on global chessboard, and why this matters way beyond Djibouti's borders for governance across the entire African continent. Let's get into it. All right, let me get this straight. On October 26, 2025, Sunday afternoon, Djibouti City, the National Assembly is in session. They have got one thing on the agenda, just one constitutional amendment to vote on, and the measure is pretty straightforward. Remove Article 23 of the Constitution. That's the part that says you can't run for president if you are older than 75. Simple as that. They vote. The result, unanimous. All 65 lawmakers who were present said yes. Not one single person stood up and said no. Not one abstention. In just one session, they erased the constitutional provision, the one that was designed to eventually put a limit on how long someone could stay president. Now, who benefits from this? Well, that's pretty obvious. President Ismaïl Omar Guelleh, he is 77 years old right now. He has been running Djibouti since May 1999. That's pretty much the same month and year that Nigeria returned to democracy. Now, that's when he took over from his uncle, Hassan Guelleh. So, we are talking 26 years in power already. And here's the part that really gets me. Guelleh himself pushed for this age limit back in 2010. He championed these constitutional reforms that put in the 75-year age cap. But this is the kicker. That same 2010 amendment also removed the 2-term limit that used to restrict president. So basically, he gave himself unlimited terms, but promised, hey, don't worry, I will step down at 75. Well, that promise, it just got shredded because the National Assembly Speaker, he gets up and defends the whole thing. What's his argument? We need stability in a troubled region. He's out here claiming over 80% of Djiboutians support letting Guelleh keep going on indefinitely. But here's the problem with that number. There is no independent polling data backing it up. And given how restricted the media environment is in Djibouti, good luck verifying anything independently. So, what happens next? The procedural timeline is already set. Guelleh can either sign off on this amendment himself or, and this will be very interesting, he could call for a national referendum. But let's be real about his track record. He's probably just going to approve it. Then there is a second parliamentary vote. It is scheduled for early November, just to lock it all in. And exactly 1 week after that, November 8th, the ruling party is holding this extraordinary Congress. Everything is basically choreographed. The outcome is already decided. Now, the opposition voices, the ones that are still active, still brave enough to speak up, they are calling it what it is. Omar Ali Ewado from the Djiboutian League for Human Rights, he says straight up, this revision is preparing for a presidency for life. Daha Ahmed Farah from the opposition movement, he's telling international stakeholders they need to rethink their support because that strategic interest should be about the Djiboutian people, not just one guy staying in power. But Djibouti is not doing this in isolation. This exact move, scrapping constitutional limits so aging president can stay forever, it has been happening all over Africa for the past 2 decades. The script is pretty much identical every single time, which raises the real question here. Is Djibouti just the latest country following this pattern? And if this is a pattern, what is it really telling us about where governance is heading across Africa? Let me just walk you through this timeline because once you see it laid out, the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. We have Uganda in 2017, Rwanda 2015, Cameroon way back in 2008, Chad same October 2025, this October. So basically just weeks before what Djibouti did. And then we have the Republic of Congo, Burundi, Togo. It's one country after another. Parliament just changing their constitution to remove or water down restrictions on how long presidents can serve. Now, sure, each case has its own specific circumstances, its own local politics. But the way it happens, the procedures they use, it's remarkably similar. Let's start with Uganda, December 2017. Uganda's parliament votes to delete Article 102, Part B of their constitution. That's the article that sets a presidential age limit of 75 years. And this change meant President Yoweri Museveni, who has been in power since 1986, he could keep seeking terms even though he was already past that age threshold. Now, here's what makes this wild. Afrobarometer polling from February 2022 showed about 85% of Ugandans wanted those age limits put back in. 85%. The amendment passed anyways. Museveni won his 6th term in 2021. And if you count his time before term limits even existed, we are talking about his 8th presidential term right now. Then we have Rwanda, because back in December 2015, they had a constitutional referendum. The official result came back saying 98.3% voted yes for changes that would let President Paul Kagame potentially serve until 2034. Now, these amendments, they cut the presidential terms from 7 years down to 5. But then they created these special provisions. Kagame gets 1 more 7-year term and then 2 5-year terms after that. Opposition parties reported they couldn't even campaign freely. And in September 2023, Kagame announced he's going for a 4th term. Cameroon might be the most extreme example because in 2008, their parliament just abolished the whole provision limiting president to 2 terms. President Paul Biya, he took office in 1982. He is already 92 years old as of right now. Africa's longest serving leader at this point. In October 2025, while all this was happening, Cameroon held elections with Biya already declared the winner. That means his 43-year-old will be going on, will keep going. And get this, about 60% of Cameroon's population is under 25 years old. So we have this massive youth population being governed by someone who was born in 1933. That was before the Second World War. So this guy predates the United Nations as an organization. So Chad's situation is even more recent. October 3rd, 2025. Their parliament voted to scrap presidential term limit completely, while at the same time stretching each term from 5 years to 7. This came after President Mahamat Idris Deby took power when his father, Idris Deby, who had ruled for 30 years, was killed in battle back in 2021. But I respect the fact that his father died in battle. It means he was active. He wasn't old like Paul Biya or Alhassan Ouattara. So I digress. So the dynasty just continues. Human Rights Watch came out and said this amendment undermines the rule of law, but it passed anyways. Now, there's research on this pattern. The data is pretty clear. The African Center for Strategic Studies, they documented all of this. As of 2024, 18 African countries don't have term limits, and 10 of those, they used to have them, but they overturned them. Now, leaders in countries without term limits, they stay in power an average of 22 years. Compare that to just 4 years in countries that still have limits. And here is the concerning part. Their research shows countries without term limits are 3 times more likely to experience political violence and armed conflict. 3 times. Now, the justifications, they are always the same playbook: stability, security concerns. Sometimes they claim is what the people want, but the outcomes, power gets concentrated, democratic competition shrinks, and institutions, they just get weaker. So why does Djibouti matter specifically in all of this? Because unlike most of these other countries, Djibouti sits on geography that has made it host to this just unprecedented concentration of military presence. And that presence creates a whole different set of calculations. Understanding those strategic dynamics, that's the key to understanding why this age limit removal is getting so little international pushback. Okay, let's talk numbers for just a second. They really put Djibouti's situation in perspective. The country covers about 23,200 square kilometers. Like we said, slightly smaller than New Jersey. The population, roughly 1 million people, and the GDP in 2023 was estimated at around $3.6 billion. It's not a lot, but inside this small territory, you have one of the most concentrated collection of foreign military installations anywhere on the planet. Americans, the French, the Chinese, the Japanese, Italians, other forces, they are all maintaining facilities, often just kilometers from each other. And the reason for all of this is the geography. Djibouti sits right on the western shore of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's the narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and then out to the Indian Ocean. At the narrowest point, we are talking about 29 kilometers wide. That's it. And according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, about 6.2 million barrels per day of crude oil and refined petroleum products, they went through the Bab el-Mandeb back in 2018, plus significant liquefied natural gas shipments. If this choke point gets disrupted for any reason, ships have to go all the way around the entire African continent. So yeah, it matters. Camp Lemonia, that's the main US military installation. It's the only permanent American military base in Africa. They have got about 4,000 personnel there, according to Department of Defense information. It's basically the hub for US African command operations, counter-terrorism missions, regional security, and God knows what else. The US pays Djibouti around $63 million a year just in rent. Though some sources put the total economic impact way higher when you factor in all the contracts and services. France, they have been there even longer. They maintain about 1,500 troops at what is now called French forces in Djibouti. This has been operating continuously since before Djibouti even got independence in 1977. France sees this as strategically critical for regional interventions, intelligence gathering, protecting French interests across Francophone Africa and the Indian Ocean. Then China shows up, August 2017. They opened their first overseas military support base in Djibouti. It's located about 12 kilometers from Camp Lemonia, that is US military base. Officially, it's designed as a logistics and support facility, for anti-piracy operations and UN peacekeeping. But let's be clear about what this really represents. This is China's first permanent overseas military presence, and it supports their Belt and Road Initiative security interests. Some assessments say the facility can handle up to 10,000 personnel. Now, Japan, they established their first overseas military base since World War II in Djibouti back in 2011, primarily for anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. Italy has their facilities there, supporting regional operations and training. Saudi Arabia established a presence in recent years. The fact that all these rival powers are operating there simultaneously and peacefully, quietly I might add, that's unprecedented. And the economic impact on Djibouti is substantial. A 2019 study estimated that these foreign military base revenue, they bring in about $300 million annually to Djibouti's economy. That's roughly 8 to 10% of the entire GDP. So there is serious dependency here, and that's real leverage for President Guelleh's government. Then you add Ethiopia into the mix. Ethiopia is landlocked, population of about 123 million people, second most populated in Africa, and they depend on Djibouti for approximately 95% of their import-export trade. China financed and built this $4 billion railway connecting Addis Ababa to Djibouti city, finished since 2017. Now, that railway, it just reinforced Ethiopia's dependence while creating massive debt obligations for both countries. So, here's what this strategic geography creates. It creates a calculation that just doesn't exist in most African countries. Foreign powers, and I'm talking the United States, France, China specifically, they've got concrete strategic interest in keeping stable access to their facilities. And that creates incentives to put continuity over democratic accountability. So when Guelleh consolidates power, these external actors, they have a choice: challenge his governance practices and risk complications to their base assets, or stay quiet and keep things operationally stable. The evidence shows they keep choosing option 2, stay quiet, maintain access, which brings us to what these foreign powers aren't saying publicly about where Djibouti's democracy is headed. So, after the April 2021 presidential election, this is the one where Guelleh officially got 97.4% of the vote. The US State Department put out a statement. They congratulated him. They called for continued democratic reforms and respect for human rights. The African Union, they sent an election observation mission. It assessed the election as having taken place in a peaceful environment. They noted some concerns about opposition participation, but overall, pretty positive. China congratulated him without any commentary on the electoral process itself. But there is a lot this statement left out. Context that matters. The major opposition parties, including the Union for National Salvation Coalition, they boycotted the 2021 election completely. Their argument was that the conditions just didn't exist for free and fair competition. And according to official figures, only about 215,000 voters were even registered, out of an estimated population of 990,000 people. That is extremely low engagement, even when you account for the age demographics. Now let's talk about the press freedom situation, because it's documented by multiple monitoring organizations. Reporters Without Borders, they ranked Djibouti 168 out of 180 countries in their 2024 World Press Freedom Index. That's a massive drop from 143rd position back in 2023. The organization notes that Djibouti's media landscape, is just dominated by state-controlled outlets. Independent journalism faces systematic obstacles. We are talking surveillance, intimidation, legal pressure. It's not a free press environment. And the US State Department's own 2023 Human Rights Report on Djibouti, it documents some pretty significant concerns: arbitrary detention, restrictions on freedom of expression and press, substantial interference with peaceful assembly and association, serious restrictions on political participation, and serious government corruption. Now, these are documented in America's own official reports. Yet, somehow, these concerns coexist with continued US military and security cooperation, valued at tens of millions of dollars annually. Now, the contradictions is pretty stark. Then you look at the economic indicators. Underneath all this stability rhetoric, according to World Bank data, youth unemployment in Djibouti was estimated at about 76% as of recent measurement. That is among the highest rates globally for a country that is a little bit 1 million people. Now, overall unemployment is around 26%. About 43.8% of the population lives below the international poverty line. The median age is approximately 26 years, which means most Djiboutians, they have only ever known Guelleh's presidency their entire lives, much like Cameroon and elsewhere. Despite all that revenue from foreign military installations, from port operations, all those strategic location advantages, where is that word going? Infrastructure development happened, sure, but the benefits aren't spread evenly. Youth employment opportunities remain severely limited, despite what the government says about job creation being a priority. So you have this major contradiction in the stability narrative. Foreign governments, they document these governance concerns in their official reports, all the while maintaining partnerships that give Guelleh's government resources and legitimacy. The strategic calculation is seems pretty consistent across board. Democratic accountability matters less than operational continuity, especially when your core security interests are involved. Now, China's approach is different in rhetoric, but not really in outcome. China typically doesn't condition its investment on governance reforms. They prefer non-interference principles, which means Chinese infrastructure financing and military cooperation, they just proceed regardless of Djibouti's political trajectory. And that gives Guelleh additional options when he faces any Western pushback. What this creates is a governance environment where international accountability mechanisms, they just stay weak. Guelleh can maneuver between partners. He can leverage the competition for access. So when Western nations raise concerns, he has Chinese alternatives. When China tries to push for exclusive influence, the Western president provides a counterbalance. The president keeps his power, while these external actors prioritize their own interests over democratic consolidation. But it's not just foreign power calculations shaping Djibouti's political trajectory. There are internal dynamics too, around succession, elite competition, and that matters significantly. Because behind all this constitutional maneuvering, there's a complex struggle happening over who actually controls Djibouti after Guelleh, whenever that transition finally happens. Okay, on September 2025, Alexis Mohamed Gouledon, he resigns from his position as Senior Communications Advisor and Presidential Spokesman. And this was not some quiet retirement. In his resignation statement, Gouledon went after what he called democratic regression, lack of transparency in economic and diplomatic agreements, marginalization of Republican institutions, and nepotistic state management. He explicitly opposed any constitutional amendment that would let Guelleh seek more terms. He called term limits an essential foundation of democracy. Then, he positioned himself as having presidential ambitions. That's not a resignation. That's a political declaration of war. Now, to understand why this matters, you need context on Djibouti's ethnic composition. The Issa ethnic group, they are part of the larger Somali ethnic family. They make up about 60% of Djibouti's population, according to various demographic estimates. The Afar people, they represent roughly 35%. And these aren't just demographic categories on paper. These are political power bases with distinct interests and histories of competition over resources and political representation. President Guelleh himself, he belongs to the Isa Mamasan clan structure. His political base has historically drawn from Isa networks, though he has incorporated Afar representation in government positions as part of coalition building. This ethnic balancing, it has been part of Djiboutian politics since independence. Now, succession speculation for years has focused heavily on Abdullah Kamil. He is the son of the First Lady, Kadra Mohammed, from a previous marriage. So, his Guelleh stepson, Naguib's held various positions. He has been widely viewed as being groomed for potential succession. So what makes this age limit removal so strategically important in this context? It's about flexibility. If Guelleh plans to run again in 2026, the age restriction would have prevented it. If he intends to manage the succession carefully, having extra time allows for coordination among these competing factions. If health or other factors intervene, his options stay open rather than being constitutionally forced. But this uncertainty, it creates real tension. In political systems where power is highly personalized rather than institutionalized, succession transitions carry significant risk. Factions prepare for multiple scenarios. Loyalties might be conditional. External actors are watching carefully, worried that succession struggles could destabilize a strategically vital location. The age limit remover, it doesn't resolve these tensions. It just postpones the questions while keeping control firmly with Guelleh. But postponement has limits. Eventually, succession has to happen. And when it does, all these ethnic calculations, all these factional interests, and all these foreign policy considerations, they are all going to come into play simultaneously. Yet, Djibouti's succession drama is happening within a much larger continental context, because across Africa, aging leaders extending their rule, it's creating this massive generational divide with profound implications, because the majority of Africans are under 30 and their leaders, increasingly, they are over 70. That disconnect, it matters in ways we really need to talk about. According to United Nations demographic data, Africa's median age is about 19 years. 19. That makes it the world's youngest continent demographically. And yet, governance is increasingly characterized by long-serving leaders who came to power decades ago. And the disconnect between the population age structure and the leadership age, it creates multiple tensions that are getting harder and harder to ignore. In Djibouti specifically, the median age is around 26 years. President Guelleh is 77. Just do the math on that. Anyone under 44 years old has known only Guelleh's presidency their entire adult life. In Cameroon, where about 60% of the population is under 25, President Biya is 92, and he has been running things since 1982. In Uganda, the median age is approximately 16 years. President Museveni has been ruling since 1986, before most of the population was even born. Now, the economic implications of this generational disconnect, they are massive, because youth unemployment rates across many African countries, they significantly exceed the overall unemployment globally. In Djibouti, youth unemployment is at 76%. Limited employment opportunities, they drive brain drain. Educated young people emigrate looking for better prospects elsewhere. Those who stay often end up working in informal sectors with limited security or chances for advancement. Political participation pathways narrow when leadership transitions get blocked. Young people have limited opportunity to enter political systems that are just dominated by long-established networks. So when constitutional changes prevent term limits, the message is being sent clear. Positions of power aren't going to become available through democratic processes, and that drives political disengagement, because voting starts to look like it can't actually produce any change. And there's research documenting some concerning correlations here. The African Center for Strategic Studies Analysis, it finds that countries without term limits experience armed conflict at about 3 times the rate of countries with functioning term limits. Now, correlation doesn't prove causation. We have to be careful about that. But the pattern suggests that blocking peaceful transitions, it might increase the likelihood of violent transitions. When constitutional processes close off, external processes, they start looking more attractive to people who are seeking change. The African Union's own African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, which entered into force in 2012, it states in Article 23 that any constitutional amendment or revision that infringes on democratic change of government represents an unconstitutional change of government. That's their own charter. Yet, the enforcement mechanisms remain weak. When member states remove term limits or age caps, AU responses have typically been limited to statements of concern rather than concrete consequences. This creates institutional credibility challenges. If continental bodies establish principles but don't enforce them, those principles just become aspirational rather than binding. Member states observe that violations carry minimal consequences, and that reduces any deterrent effect. The sovereignty question, that adds complexity here. Many African leaders argue that constitutional matters are internal affairs, where external actors shouldn't interfere, and that sovereignty claim can be legitimate given colonial-era interference patterns. There is real history there. But when sovereignty arguments get used to shield constitutional manipulation that violates continental charters that governments voluntarily ratified, then sovereignty arguments become shells for authoritarianism rather than protections of self-determination. True democratic sovereignty, it requires functional institutions, rules of law, systems where citizens can peacefully change their leaders. When presidents manipulate constitutions to stay indefinitely, they are not protecting sovereignty, they are undermining it by concentrating power and weakening institutions. The generational implications, they go way beyond any single country because young Africans are increasingly consuming information globally. They are comparing their situations to their peers elsewhere. They see technological innovation, entrepreneurship, political engagement happening in other regions among their own age cohorts. Meanwhile, they are being governed by septuagenarians and octogenarians who came to power in completely different eras. And this disconnect, it breeds frustration that manifests in multiple ways. Some people disengage from politics entirely. Others channel that energy into civil society, media, activism. Still, others emigrate, and some turn to radical alternatives, promising rapid change. Each response reflects the reality that conventional political pathways appear blocked. The question for Africa's democratic future is whether this generational transition can eventually occur peacefully through institutional channels, or whether blocked transitions will ultimately produce crisis transitions. History suggests that the prolonged blockage of peaceful change, it just increases pressure until it releases through less controlled means. So Djibouti's age limit removal matters, not just for Djibouti, but as part of this continental pattern. Each constitutional manipulation that extends incumbent rule, it sends signals to young populations about whether democratic processes can actually produce leadership change. And those signals, they shape how the next generation engages with governance or doesn't. So, Djibouti's next scheduled presidential election is April 2026. If this constitutional amendment gets final approval, which I guarantee you it will get, that will happen in early November 2025. If it happens, President Guelleh will face no age restriction, preventing him from seeking a 6th term. And based on patterns from previous elections, there are several scenarios we can map out. The most straightforward scenario, Guelleh contests the 2026 election. Given his control of the state institutions, the security apparatus, electoral processes, plus the opposition's weakness and fragmentation, a victory will be highly probable. He could have above 90% as usual. Opposition parties might boycott again, just like they did in 2021, arguing the conditions doesn't exist for genuine competition. International observers will likely issue carefully worded statements, noting concerns while accepting the result. Guelleh would then govern for another 5-year term through 2031, when he would be 82 years old, and there would be no constitutional barrier to seeking more terms even after that. Second scenario, this involves a managed succession. Guelleh could use the age limit removal to buy time for careful transition planning rather than facing a forced exit in 2026. This might mean eventually stepping aside for a chosen successor, whether that's Naguib Camille, if those ethnic faction dynamics can be resolved, an ISA alternative that is acceptable to the key power brokers. Now, the advantage of this approach is maintaining power structure continuity while addressing succession challenges without the constitutional age limit forcing his hand. Now, the third scenario, and less predictable, involves unexpected development. A health crisis could force an unmanaged succession, potentially triggering competition among factions without any clear resolution mechanisms. Alternatively, significant shifts in foreign power calculations, say if US or Chinese policy towards Djibouti change dramatically, that might alter the external support environment that currently enables Guelleh's governance approach. Internal unrest, while difficult given the security apparatus's capacity, it remains, especially if economic conditions deteriorate significantly or if regional conflict impact Djibouti more directly. Now, for continental governance, Djibouti represents a test case. Will other African countries follow this pattern? And I guarantee you they will, because recent evidence suggests the trend is continuing. Chart October 2025 term limit removal. That happened just weeks before Djibouti's vote. Will African Union enforcement mechanisms strengthen, or will the gap between the charter principles and the actual practice just keep widening? The fundamental question for Pan-African sovereignty is whether governance institutions can be built that serve citizens rather than incumbent, whether accountability mechanisms can be established that constrain executive power rather than just rubber-stamping executive preferences, whether sovereignty will be understood as protecting people's rights or protecting presidential tenure. Historical evidence suggests we should be cautious about extended rule. Research consistently shows that countries blocking peaceful leadership transitions, they face elevated risk of instability and conflict. The stability that long-serving leaders promise, it often proves fragile because it rests on personal control rather than institutional resilience. When transitions eventually occur, whether it's through death, a health crisis, or internal power struggles, systems built around individuals rather than institutions tend to fracture. Genuine stability that requires institutional capacity to manage leadership transitions peacefully. It requires economic systems that provide opportunities for young populations. It requires political systems where citizens can change their leaders through ballot rather than bullets. None of that exists when 77-year-old president remove age limit. All the while, foreign powers prioritize base access over democratic accountability. Now, Djibouti's parliament vote is part of a broader pattern, one that reveals tensions between stated democratic commitments and actual governance practices, between continental charter principles and member state compliance, between youth demographic majorities and aging leadership minorities, and between strategic foreign interests and democratic accountability. The answer to whose Africa this becomes, whether it's the president extending their rule indefinitely, or the foreign powers enabling them for strategic assets, or the 70% of Africans under 30 seeking political agency, that's going to define the next generation of African governance. Right now, in a small but strategically vital country on the Red Sea, that question is being answered through constitutional process, and the implications, they extend far beyond Djibouti's borders. Now, if you have watched to this point, this is Frontline Africa, and thank you for watching. This is where we talk about geopolitics from Africa's own point of view. This is where we bring you the stories that mainstream media does everything to avoid. Now, go to the comment section. If you're African, if you are an African in diaspora, we want to hear your voice. Do you think that Africa should continue on this path of extended rules where septuagenarians and octogenarians continue to amend the constitution to perpetuate power, to continue staying in power. They don't just stop at amending these constitutions. They also do everything in their power to win re-election when they eventually have to face election. And now the next thing they could possibly do is to remove elections entirely. We already see the blueprint being perfected elsewhere in Africa. And these are troubling matters that demand your input as an African or someone that is interested in African affairs. And if you want to see more of my content, maybe consider to subscribe and turn on those notifications. I am your host, Ezekiel Enejeta, and I will see you in the next one. It's a bye-bye for now.